All right, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Housing First for Youth, its application and its responsibilities. My name is Jacob Gorenkoff, and I'm the Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives for the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm currently on in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I thank them for allowing me to live, work, and play on this land. We are currently in Zoom webinar format, so you're all muted. If you wish to ask questions, you may type them in the Q&A section on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation, and we will address as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. I'd now like to pass the floor to David French, Managing Director of Away Home Canada, to introduce today's speakers. David.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to do more than introduce today's speakers. I'm going to take a bit of airtime too. And I want to thank Jacob and CHRA for allowing us to be here and share the space with yourselves as attendees and get into some of the dynamics around Housing First for Youth, because it's certainly one of those things that as we continue to evolve within this work, it continues to be a hot button opportunity for us and something that raises people's awareness. And so I think it's important that we continue to sort of socialize and create opportunities for unique dialogue around Housing First for Youth. And so we are missing one panelist, so I'll introduce her when she gets here. But today's webinar is going to be one about information sharing, but also about storytelling and these opportunities that we've had around Housing First for Youth and how those real-time implementation opportunities, program development opportunities, and enhancements have really helped to shape and inform the flexibility of Housing First for Youth. And it's something we talk about a lot. It's something we always suspected around Housing First for Youth, that it would create flexibility, and there was adaptation and there was opportunity within it. But now, as we see it rolling out into communities, we can continue to articulate what those realities look like. And so I'm joined and will be joined, my dog wants out again, by four speakers. And first and foremost, as a member of my team within Away Home Canada, I've got Heidi Walter here, and she is the manager of training and implementation. And Heidi's experience bridged not only practical and on the ground experiences in service delivery, but she captures a level of architecture and thought leadership around youth homelessness, specifically youth homelessness prevention in the sector, both nationally and internationally, that is really, really palatable. And she's in this thought leadership space with communities across Canada and internationally. It's really helping shape our understanding with this. We're also joined by Eric Wexler, who has more than 10 years of lived experience of youth homelessness in Toronto and Montreal, actually. So as we continue to evolve in this work, Eric is one of those voices that keeps us grounded. He also has a decade of experience working professionally within frontline social work, and he's currently the manager at Wood Green and runs the Free to Be program, which he's going to talk to a bit more. We're joined also by Zach Batalden, who's out west, who's the manager of housing with PCRS Vancouver, a program which provides support for over 100 youth at risk. He's worked in this space for over 12 years. And then Cheryl, who's joining us shortly, is the manager of housing and homeless supports and services with the Hamilton Regional Indian Center. And she is part of the development team that developed an Indigenous Housing First for Youth project called NBM, which she'll speak to more. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm going to get through a couple little details around sort of those components, and then we're going to roll into some presentations. And Eric's going to be first, then Zach, then Cheryl. And so everyone can see that. Oops, I'm not sharing on the slideshow. Pardon me. And so, yeah, we're here to talk about Housing First, its application and its opportunities. And as Away Home, for those of you that aren't familiar, Away Home is a national coalition that's speaking and looks to reimagine solutions to youth homelessness, and specifically around areas of intersection around policy, planning, and practice. And so we know that there are multiple opportunities to form this work at a policy level. We know there are multiple opportunities to think differently about systems planning and planning at the community level. But we also know where the root of this work and the success of this work and where uptake comes is from practice realities. And so we're into this space around practice realities, specifically around Housing First for Youth. And one of the things that I want to impart right in the beginning of this is that within Housing First for Youth, you're not alone in your implementation and your thinking and your questions about the realities of Housing First for Youth. 5 years ago, when I started to really sort of get climatized towards Housing First for Youth in my work previous to this with the Alberta government, I sort of felt like there's more to come. And we're really at the tip of what we could understand around Housing First for Youth. And as you can see here, and these are just a couple of examples of really practical tools and guides that allow communities and decision makers and policymakers and funders to think differently about Housing First for Youth. What there is on the right-hand side also is access to resources and tools that can really accelerate your opportunity within a community setting or within an organizational setting to think differently about Housing First for Youth. And so as we get into this and as we get into some of this dialogue, we're going to kind of pull off the veil on some of these questions around the reality of Housing First for Youth. And I want you to keep those in mind because we're going to have time, hopefully at the end of this, for some questions and some dialogue. And so don't lose sight of those questions you may have as our speakers continue to roll through their work, because they will sort of shine the light on some things maybe that may trigger something for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Heidi.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And hello, everybody. It is great to be with you and share space with you today. I'm just going to take a few minutes of your time because I want the light to be shone brightly on those who are doing all of the fabulous work, which are the wonderful colleagues that you see here today that I have the privilege of working with quite often. So what I want to share with you first is a little bit about who the training and technical assistance team is and the work that we do on the ground. Here is just a little bit of an overview. Our community of practices are a really unique space that we hold. And it was a few years ago, actually, that our community of practices started to unfold. That work really looked like at the beginning of the pandemic, where individuals and organizations really was looking for a place to come together, a place to have space to learn about the emerging issues, to be a resource and a support for each other, and really to honestly be able to share resources and to share guidance, because we were all learning in such a unique time that none of us had ever gone through before. And so we held that space with each other. We were starting to learn about how we were going to support young people and their families differently. And one of the other big pieces of work that we were doing was we were checking in with staff. We know that burnout was absolutely a thing, and people were working 12 and 16-hour days. And we were really taking the time to ask people how they were doing and checking in on our people. 2 years later, I'm really excited to share with you that our community practices have grown. If you're interested in those, please reach out, but we can share more information with you about those. But we meet on a weekly basis, and one of my incredible colleagues looks over those community practices, and she really shares the work that we do. And Zach and folks like Zach meet with us on a weekly basis to talk about the emerging issues. And from that larger group of community of practice from the youth sector nationally, we also have two other community practices that branched out. One being one that focuses primarily on service providers and leaders within the Housing First for Youth work, and then also one that focuses on the prevention work that's going on across our community, and as David said, nationally and also internationally. Some of the other incredible work that we are doing currently is also lots of different trainings that we're really excited to share have gone back to being in person, which is so amazing. And those really encompass the Housing First for Youth program model, and as well as the natural supports. Some of the other work that we are also doing and sharing across our community is program implementation, program design, as well as systems planning and fidelity reviews. And that really looks like supporting those organizations and those programs that are wanting to enhance their work and enhance the outcomes of the service models that they've chosen to operate within their communities. We also have, if you haven't checked it out, it's absolutely brilliant, the Homelessness Learning Hub. And it is a free online training resource that is absolutely an incredible wealth of knowledge to any of you that would like to access it. It holds space for those who are maybe coming into the work for the first time and would like to learn more about the program models. It also has a wealth of research and resources. One of the really fabulous things about the online trainings is not only that they are free, but they are also self-directed and you can complete them at your own pace. We've had lots of feedback from our community and from the youth sector that have shared with us that these have been great modules to introduce staff during the onboarding process and also to be able to use as continuing development through staff meetings and team meetings to be able to just pick out a few of those models and really reflect on their practices and how the pieces of the model and the core principles are showing up in the individual's work. So check it out if you have the opportunity to do so. I think that is it for me, David, on that slide, please. David also spoke really briefly about the wonderful program model and operations manual that we released late this summer. This was an exciting piece of work that I had the opportunity to work with some colleagues on, and these were a few years in the making. This came from a lot of thoughtfulness and a lot of work collaborating with the community, understanding what the youth sector and those in the service, those service providers was looking for as far as supports. The operations manual was a new piece of work because all of a sudden we were starting to hear that individuals were understanding the core principles and were they resonated with them, but now they wanted to understand how the work needed to be done, not just the why of the work. And so the operations manual took life, and it is a great piece of work that was developed by our community members and colleagues alike to be able to join those pieces of work together. I think that they're always going to be in development because we're always learning, and was really exciting to be able to share my experience as a Housing First for Youth program manager for several years to be able to also bring those experiences to light within these operation manuals and program model guides. And last but not least, one of our new pieces of work that we are, again, very excited to share and that we've been working on is the Family and Natural Supports model. One of the big conversations that we are constantly having around family and natural supports is it's a framework and it can be a standalone model, and it's also principles that should be infused in all of the work that we do. You will, if you're familiar with the Family and Natural Supports framework, understanding that it's really a shift in the way that we as service providers deliver our services to young people and families. And so you will find that we use the language that we're shifting from a status quo approach to a family natural supports approach. So what that really means is looking and taking a step back, as not seeing ourselves as the expert, but engaging the families and the young people as the experts, and understanding that they have a wealth of knowledge and that they have a wealth of skills, and that they are able to use their own resources with our supports. And so instead of immediately inserting professional supports, we seek out the resources that they already have within their own structures and within their own family models. Going back to my first comment around, is this a program on its own, or is this a set of core principles? And we believe that it can be both. We see lots of communities with across our country that are using a family natural supports, infusing the core principles and the way that that work should show up within all of their programs. And we're also seeing it as a standalone program within organizations. What we do know to be true, and what we've learned from folks like the ones that you're going to be hearing from in a second, and other of our community partners, is that the family natural supports work can't be, or sorry, the Housing First for Youth work can't be done without engaging family natural supports. And if you are familiar with the Housing First for Youth core principles, you will see that language where we have to engage community and we have to include social inclusion in our young people's lives, which includes their families. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, David.
Yes, thank you, Heidi. Next, we're going to move on to Eric. So just next slide me, Eric, when you're ready, okay?
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I can't see any of you because the way the Zoom is set up is in panel mode. So to anyone who's on the call, thanks for joining today. David, thanks for the very kind introduction, and Heidi, thank you as well. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about one of 3 demonstrations in Ontario, specifically that's supporting Housing First for Youth. I am working out of Woodgreen Community Services, which is a large Toronto-based agency. It's the 2nd largest social housing provider in the province, I believe. We are a very large multi-service organization supporting newcomers, refugees, seniors, youth. We have multiplicity of take cares and a variety of different housing programs. So let's just move. Well, actually, before we move to the next slide, I just want to say sort of the path I've taken for this call. My assumption was that most of you have a general understanding of the core principles, which I'm glad Heidi kind of went over some of those, and so did David. So I'm not going to really linger on stuff specific to the core principles of Housing First. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of walk through the population that we're serving at Woodgreen, how we have adapted the model to fit with what we're trying to accomplish, some of the successes, some of the challenges, and then sort of end it off with a little bit about where I think Housing First may go for the population we're serving. So next slide, David. So not knowing exactly who was going to be on this call, I sort of assumed that there may be a variety of people with different levels of knowledge regarding this population. So Woodgreen is specifically demonstrating Housing First for young people leaving the care system. The name Free to Be, which was on the initial slide, was something that was designed by a group of 10 former youth in care that we worked with about a year prior to launching the demonstration. And really what Free to Be was meant to represent was a place of imagination, a place of experimentation, an opportunity to grow and develop without the constraints of traditional programming models that put rigid timelines onto people, and among a group of people who had significant trauma and attachment loss and who had aged out of the system several times over. So Free to Be, as I said, supports young people aging out of the care system. At intake, we usually intake between the ages of 17 to 24 without any aging out criteria, so we can have people in the program indefinitely. We chose 17 because we launched during the implementation of VISA, the Voluntary Youth Services Agreement, which was a new piece of legislation that allowed young people over the age of 16 to voluntarily access supports without having to be going through the traditional sort of protection stream. And we wanted to make sure that we were going slightly more upstream to include people that hadn't yet aged out of care, regardless of whether they had gone through a VISA. So just to give you a sense of some of the data specific to the population we serve. So as many of you may know, young people between the ages of 13 to 24 make up approximately 20% of the homelessness population in Canada. And of that number, roughly almost 60%, 57.8% of homeless youth have touched the child welfare system. Coming out of another report from the previous Provincial Child and Youth Advocates Office, a survey of Crown wards in Ontario found that 21% of children and youth in care under the age 18 had not enrolled in school, and nationally, only 30% of Canadian youth in care had completed high school. Those numbers are even worse when you look at the provincial data, with 44% of youth having a high school diploma or a high school degree upon aging out of care, compared to the 81% of their counterparts who are not in care in Ontario. 52% of young people left care with minimal or no prior work experience. Some reports through Stepstones for Youth, which is another Toronto youth agency supporting young people aging out of care, commented that former youth in care were victims of a crime within 12 months of leaving the care system. In addition, the overrepresentation of young people, particularly racialized Black and people of color male youth, over 46% of those youth had been arrested within a very short time frame of leaving the care system. Next slide, please. So this is just a sort of match. That was all provincial and federal national level data. So these are some of the trends we were seeing in the program, which really speaks to, and this is a snapshot in time from the last year. So roughly 95% of youth in our program were between the ages of 17 and 24, with roughly 5% being 25 or over. 54% were cisgender male, 29% cisgender male, and roughly 17% were non-binary fluid trans. More than 80% of youth in our program are Black, racialized, or Indigenous, and 34% are of the LGBTQ2S+ community. Roughly 25% have completed high school in our program, demonstrating that disparity in the labor market that I mentioned in the previous slide. And almost 50% of youth in Free to Be have been, or about to access OW or ODSP. So there's been a lot of conversation on other calls specific to the Ontario Works ODSP pipeline from the care system in the province of Ontario. And I'm sure it's quite similar in other provinces, where we're seeing that dependency model for youth that are in care and accessing CCSY, which is an aftercare support, going on to access other provincial, not entitlements, but provincial supports long after. So rather than completing their high school education, rather than going on to a post-secondary education, they wind up on ODSP and continue that way long into their 30s. Almost 1/3 of female youth in Free to Be have experienced some form of domestic violence, human and or sex trafficking, which is an ongoing issue that we've seen in our program. In fact, just in the last 6 months, we've had 4 cases of human trafficking. More than 80% of clients in Free to Be carry a mental health diagnosis or struggle with mental health. And we have definitely identified a significant overrepresentation of incarcerations or significant profiling for young Black or racialized male post-leaving care in our program. Next slide, please. Oh, wow. So there's a lot of, this is going to be kind of blurry. I think there's been a bit of a, I hope that doesn't happen with the other slides, but there's going to be a bit of an overlap with some of the text. So basically this conceptual was an early response. It was something that was designed to be an adaptation to the Housing First for Youth model, more broadly speaking. And so focused on 3 major outcome areas that encapsulate quite a bit. So one of them being housing security, another one being access to supports and services in community, and then the third one being connection to their family and to social ties and feeling that sense of amplification as well. And so the 3 major outcome areas that encapsulate, I would say I think 7 or 8 outcomes that we focus on within Housing First for Youth are spoken about in the center. So that housing stabilization supports, the intensive case management and counseling pieces, and the community engagement and youth amplification. So along each of those axes are a number of things. I think the thing I really want to focus on, though, if I were to speak to, is the intensive case management and counseling pieces and the community components. So just before we move to the next slide, I think it's important to note in Housing First that one of the things that makes this program so unique is that we're dealing with small caseload sizes with often moderate to high acuity young people, so people that are increasingly complex in terms of their needs, with no discharge into homelessness and no rigid dates upon completion. This gives us a really solid amount of time to work with young people. You know, some of the data and some of the reports you read specific to ACT teams or LINK teams or intensive case management models really show best practices. And I think this is very much aligned with that, with the one caveat that oftentimes existing intensive case management programs, existing ACT team models usually have a bit of a timeline and they're usually serving quite significant amounts of people. So the Housing First for Youth model allows us to really dig in with a young person and give them that needed time. Most young people that we've experienced in the Free to Be model usually need nothing less than 6 months to a year to even trust that we're not going to go anywhere. Most of these young people have aged out of care, if not once, but twice, because young people age out of their foster families or their group homes or their kinship situations at 18. And then they age out again of a lot of those post-care benefits at 21. And so having a model that says we're not going anywhere, we're here for the long haul as long as you need us, is both unheard of in the sector. Funders don't understand it, and yet it's absolutely required. So it's really dealing with the notion of less is more. Fewer young people on longer timelines means bigger impact. The other piece is specifically focused on making sure that young people are attached to their families, making sure that young people are attached to those that matter to them, which obviously adds a lot of challenges when we're thinking about the housing provision specifically, but making sure that young people have access to those supports, and that even though there may be a school of thought that young people who come through protection shouldn't be engaging with their families, the truth is more than 70% of young people who age out of care are reattached to their bio families. So we know that through data. So, and I know that through the program as well. So it's important that when we think about supporting young people, we're talking about supporting their moms, their dads, their aunts, their uncles, their children, their dependents, their animals. It's kind of the whole package. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I thought I would just give you, this is a snapshot from, I apologize, from more than a year ago. I haven't had a chance to do any of the synthesis for 2021 yet, because we're just coming up to the end of the year now. So this is 2020 data, but I think it's still very relevant because 2020 was a pandemic year. We were kind of experiencing the first year of lockdown. And so I think this says a lot, to be honest with you, because it was a hard year. And as Heidi mentioned earlier, we were all working 12, 16-hour days, and it was really challenging, and yet we were able to see successes. And so I just wanted to highlight 4 of the 7 or 8 outcome areas that we tend to report on Housing First for Youth. The first one being housing stability. And that really means ensuring that young people have access to a safe and affordable place to live, that they have a key to the door, that they have access to a mailbox, that they can put food in the fridge and access that food without being concerned that it's not going to be there when they get home. And so in the housing stability realm, you can see that we had an increase from the beginning to the end of the year of roughly 30% in terms of people who were experiencing improvement in their housing stability. Similarly, among the family and natural supports outcome area, we saw a roughly 30% increase as well in young people that were either more interested in, willing to work with us to, or actually engaged with their families and their natural allies. And those natural ally pieces don't just have to be blood relatives. They could be community members that they've been attached to for years, friendships that have been there for them through thick and thin, could be their teachers, their guidance counselors, anyone in their community that they've identified as their people, essentially. And our job is to ensure that they're not just connected to them, but that we're in dialogue as much as that young person is allowing us to be, to engage directly with those supports. And in some cases, that's meant that we've been supporting the whole family to sustain housing, which is unheard of again, right? In other programs where we've been able to say, okay, mom needs this extra rent to make sure that, Gigi, one of the young people in our program, can actually remain in that space. Otherwise, she's not going to be able to stay there and she's going to be homeless in 3 months. So how do we support the family to support Gigi, as an example? Education and employment. It's shocking to think that we're still able to see a 20% increase, a slightly less than 20%, I guess 16% increase in young people seeing improvements in their education and employment during the pandemic. That was actually a shock because we knew that a lot of people lost their jobs that year, and yet somehow people were still pushing through. We know that a lot of young people struggled with online learning in 2020 and into 2021, less so, and yet the improvement was there. And then finally, health and well-being, which is really an outcome area that looks at what are young people being attached to? What do they need? For instance, the young man in the picture above was an Indigenous man who was living at home when we met him and experiencing abuse at the hands of his bio mom, living in his car in the middle of the winter. And a big part of what this young man was looking for was access to Indigenous resources. And he was exploring that part of his heritage and his culture. He was also going through grief at the time. And so looking at elders and traditional teachings and knowledges that could be an alternative approach to dealing with grief and loss for him. So as an example of how we might look at an outcome area like health and well-being. Next slide, please. Gosh, coloring is a little bit off. So this is just a snapshot of the way our program operates in terms of flow. None of these things are rigid. So I want to be really clear with you. This slide would make it appear as though everything happens in these kind of cookie cutter ways, but it actually doesn't really work that way. It's just been sort of framed this way for simplicity purposes. So when young people come in the program, we typically try to engage them right away. We do meet a lot of young people who have some pretty significant urgency. So we try to connect with them in community as much as humanly possible. Free to be staff through 2020 were deemed essential workers. So we never fully stopped seeing people in person. There was a few lockdown periods where we had no choice, but we typically try to engage with people directly. We try to offer them a chance to go through what we call our service agreement, which is just essentially a way to discuss what is the agreement we're making as two people. What are the expectations? So explaining what those expectations are, walking through what some of those early goals might look like for them, understanding that those may change over time, talking a little bit about dates and what to expect, really helping to understand why we want to, we don't call it an assessment with the young person, but why we want to have these in-depth conversations to get to know them better, so that we can do better work together and so we can understand what needs to happen and where it needs to happen and how it will take place. We complete a bit of a baseline, and that baseline is really focused on skill sets. Because Housing First for Youth is dealing with a population of very young people, a big part of our focus is on transitional skill sets. So what are the things that a young person is going to need? And how do we kind of address what's going to happen when we're no longer there? So what we're looking for is replication. If we teach you something, we want to reflect on it, because if something happens and we're not here tomorrow, will you be able to replicate that practice without us being there, right? So a big part of it is essential skills development. And young people in care adds another layer to that, because many of the young people we work with maybe chronologically 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, but developmentally maybe 13, 14, 15. And some of that has to do with their ACEs, with the high levels of trauma that these young people have experienced. In some cases, it could be related to fetal alcohol syndrome or other cognitive impairments that come as a result of trauma, abuse, substances, and so on. We spend, I can't even see what that says in that box anymore, but I think it says 30 days. So we usually spend about, I would say about 4 to 6 weeks trying to really develop a bit of a rapport. We conduct what's called a youth assessment prioritization, which is a tool developed by Wally. I don't think we discussed it early on, but it's actually a tool that was validated as part of the Housing First for Youth program. And really what it is meant to be is a bit more of like a narrative-based approach to assessment that's very youth-centric and really tries to disassemble the kinds of barriers that previous assessment tools like the SPDAT and other youth assessments often erected that would really limit access to service provision. So it's meant to provide a bit of a biopsychosocial snapshot in time for the service provider without erecting any unnecessary barriers or creating composite scoring that makes professional decisions on behalf of the practitioner rather than the practitioner making decisions based on their relationship with the young person. So it's a pretty neat little tool. As I mentioned before, we do the skills-based outcomes assessment baseline with the young person. So that's a self-identified experience that we walk through with a young person so they can reflect on where they think their strengths are, where they think their weaknesses are, where they believe they need to focus their attention, especially in relationship to their goals. And we complete a financial health assessment. And that's really looking at their revenue, their entitlements, their expenses, and some of their spending behaviors to get a sense of how we might top up their existing income to support them in terms of subsidy support. In another slide, I'll quickly touch on that. And finally, the next year or so or more is focused on referral recommendation and attachment, the weekly, bi-weekly meetings, the care planning, the crisis intervention, the accompaniments, and then we redo these assessments every 90 days. Next slide, please. So this was just to give, these are a couple little things I just want to mention, because Housing First for Youth in a lot of ways is a philosophy, and it does have some basic tenets to it. And there are some very specific principles that you're operating from, but it doesn't, well, I don't want to say that it doesn't. The operational manual does speak to some very specific things that need to be in place, but there's a lot of adaptation that needs to occur based on population type, cultural context, organizational context. And so what we did here, knowing that Housing First is kind of like a very large container, we try to think about what are some of the things we know need to be true for a young person. So in that little yellow bubble at the bottom, you see the transition plans. That's something that was actually developed by Making the Shift, which essentially is a kind of a care planning tool that is conducted with a young person every 90 days. We kind of adapted it slightly to be not just a care planning tool, but a narrative, an opportunity for a young person to tell their own story. We don't write these on behalf of young people, we write them with young people. And really what we're trying to understand is across the skills-based outcome areas, which directly informs our outcomes and impacts for the program. We want to know what have we been working on in the last few months and what are the next few months going to actually look like. And that gets linked directly to that baseline skills assessment that I mentioned before. And I give a couple of examples here out of that list: housing stability and financial independence and security. Each one of those areas is broken down into two basic buckets. So using housing stability as an example, the first major bucket deals with everything that all the skills that we've determined. By the way, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is just what I could fit on the slide. List of things that we feel are skills that are needed to find the housing and to secure the housing. And the second list of things that we're looking at in terms of skills are what do you need to sustain and manage your tenancy? Really, because as I said, the skill is really meant to, the intervention is meant to focus on the building up of someone's skill set. And it's not enough just to say there's an outcome. We want to know how. We want to know, and we want to reflect on what intervention is helping to inform that improvement in that area. So doing these assessments and attaching it to the transition plan allows us to put the narrative beside the outcome area and actually get a sense of, you know, if they move from a 2 to a 3 in their ability to understand how they were going to navigate their housing situation, how does that link back to what they told us about the challenges they were having and what things were put in place so that it could get easier for them? Next slide, please. Similarly, this is our financial health tool, and we don't actually reassess the tool per se, so it's a bit of a misnomer here. So at the outset, we do a very comprehensive financial assessment. It's not an income test, so young people that are earning over a certain amount are not excluded from access to the subsidy. It's simply a way for us to understand what they're currently earning, what their spending behaviors look like, what their expenses look like, because someone who is single, living in a basement apartment and working may look very different than a person who's not working, living in a roommate situation with 2 dependents and a dog, for instance. So, you know, we don't income test, but we are trying to get a sense of what they are earning, what their revenue looks like, what their debts may look like. We give a 30, technically, ideally, the 30% RGI, the rent geared to income, is what we're aiming toward. But in Toronto and the GTA, I didn't add that to this. That's a whole other presentation just on affordable housing here in the city of Toronto and the challenges around cost of living and inflation post-pandemic, or not fully post-pandemic. But anyway, so what we tried to do is create a 30 to 60% ratio, meaning how much, not including our subsidy, of how much rent they're paying based on what they're earning. So, and then what we look at is what are the additional expenses that they have, so that if it turns out that if somebody needs an additional boost, we're still going to provide it, but we're trying to get a sense of what they're earning, what they need, and put it on a bit of a timeline. So under the policy pieces, we do ask young people to begin to think about employment in the first 6 to 9 months. I say that because the average stay in our program is roughly a year, although there are some young people who have been in our program for more than 2 years. We believe that young people need a minimum of 3 months before they graduate from the program to be fully situated in terms of their employment and those pieces. So we try to ask that young people work with us on those timelines, but there's no rigid cutoffs for that stuff. We're not saying, well, if you haven't found work, then you're cut off, or if you don't think that you're willing to work, then we're not going to help you. But we're creating some structures around this. And then income verification is just a piece around making sure that we know what they're actually earning. And we don't actually not offer supports to people if they're receiving other supports. So for instance, we have a lot of young people who are on OW, ODSP, THAP, and even other subsidies through the PAPE Adolescent Resource Center, Stepstones for Youth. We don't consider that duplication. Next slide, please. So this is really, I'm not going to linger on this one. This is just something that I guess what I want to say very quickly is that In the last 4 years of demonstrating Housing First for Youth, I can tell you that there's an enormous amount of heterogeneity in the population we serve in young people aging out of the care system. And so in an attempt to think about what Housing First actually is and what it's not, I guess what I've come to learn is that Housing First is a very intensive blast of service. The problem is that you don't want to create a rigid model that kicks people out just because they may no longer need a certain type of service. So what we've been sort of envisioning in our minds is, what is a Housing First for Youth program look like where there's a container of supports and where young people just move through a series of different touch points as needed with no end date in sight. I think one of the challenges to this type of model with Housing First for Youth, which I am going to talk a little bit about in a minute, is that what this needs to really look like is not a suite of services within Woodgreen, but a suite of services within Toronto and the GTA, where satellite locations across offer these kinds of supports to young people, because part of the Housing First for Youth model is that youth voice and choice stand at the forefront. So we're not going to force somebody to live in a property that we have just because that's what we have to offer. So we have to figure out a way to expand the field of horizons so that young people can access the support where they need it in the communities that they're already kind of involved with and that they're already embedded inside of. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I'll just run through this. There's a couple of slides here that just deal with some of the implementation pieces. So this is a slide specific to some of the internal implementation challenges. So one of the challenges I've experienced in the last 4 years is organizational readiness to develop housing for new youth populations. This is very slow to emerge, I would say. Currently, Woodgreen houses primarily seniors, even though we are like the second largest social housing provider in Ontario. We have very specific populations that we're already serving. And so very slow to emerge on having independent housing stock to support these populations. And I would say perhaps some risk aversity to looking at innovative solutions such as modular housing, where we already see that being kind of on the stage in Toronto and the GTA. The second to that would be diversifying leadership in Woodgreen to make sure that we have the proper leadership in place to support innovative solutions to youth housing. And I will say, mostly for David and Heidi's sake, we actually did just recently hire a director of the youth portfolio, which is very exciting, that comes out of YTC. So that's very exciting. Second major challenge, I would say, was and continues to be, not as much as it used to be, the challenge of producing payments to landlords in a timely manner. Woodgreen is a very large organization, and with a very small finance team. And so getting that money out to the young people and to those landlords quickly has consistently posed a challenge, and we've seen successes in other demonstrations that we need to learn from. High cost of living and skyrocketing renters markets has been a major issue. And something I just want to raise around non-transferable subsidies, where we know that young people may need ongoing financial support well after they leave a program, is a big piece of it. Ecosystem. So I already spoke about the ecosystem. So just, really looking at how to culturally adapt a Housing First for Youth model to meet the heterogeneous needs of youth coming out of the care system, and thinking more broadly about what kinds of things are needed. And then I would say the challenge of transforming the Housing First for Youth philosophy into a meaningful social practice and service delivery model. What I mean by that is trying to create a bridge between the broader strokes of fidelity in Housing First for Youth with a model that really builds out some sense of structure and mutual accountability, because it is a very broad sweeping model, Housing First for Youth. And so trying to hold fast to that idea of kind of like a non-rigid approach to serving young people, which is what's needed, while still making sure that young people feel that they're accountable to something, is a challenge. And I think there are a lot of different ways that we can come at that work. So next slide, please. Challenges in the sector. So obviously, challenge of a housing program without housing, as I mentioned already. Identifying, securing, and zoning municipal lands in Toronto and the GTA is on exceedingly long timelines. The city open door initiatives are offset by focuses on existing social housing stock, the deep retrofitting work, and modular housing at the forefront, which Woodgreen's not so sure it wants to dip its toe into yet. Identifying funding for Housing First for Youth outside of the R&D bubble is definitely a very real thing that needs to be, I think, thought through. Cultural adaptation for youth from care means longer than average service delivery timelines, as I mentioned, due to past traumas related to attachment loss, among other stressors and traumas. So with longer than average timelines and small caseloads, the client flow slows in programs like these, and the overall reach decreases, running counter to the traditional funding models that seek larger numbers on shorter timelines. So just some pieces to be thinking about as we look at a model like Housing First and how we want to sell that to our funders. And then often the left hand's not talking to the right. So with the moratorium in place for young people aging out of child welfare, the ministry's focus on readiness indicators, there still appears to be a bit of a gap in the importance placed on the community's role in upstream prevention and intervention work as it relates to street and invisible homeless for youth exiting the care system. Last slide, please. Then just finally, I think the silver lining, I want to end it off on a slightly positive note. I didn't want to end on a downer. So the promise of readiness-based approach in Housing First for Youth among youth exiting the care system. So in June 2020, many of you may already know this, there was a conversation at all levels of community, government, and policy that established a moratorium on youth exiting the care system during the pandemic. This led to a phased approach to unpack what readiness indicators look like among youth with lived experience of the care system, with lived experience experts and first voices in the community. I was fortunate enough to be a part of those early conversations, the writing of the letter, as well as phase one with the OCAC work with young people exiting the care system, and now phase two with the ministry. So very exciting work. And I will just end off by saying that I think Housing First offers an enormous resource to the work of thinking about readiness for young people exiting care. So not only does it offer a great deal of insight into the relationship between youth exiting care and invisible homelessness, I think, but it also offers essentially a model on a readiness-based approach to service delivery, where youth are acting as mutual agents and arbiters of their own process. The design of Housing First for Youth is aspirational, as far as I'm concerned, for the protection sector. Whether we're looking at some of the pieces around caseload sizes, the long timelines, and the zero discharges into homelessness, all of those things are things that I think could map nicely onto a readiness-based approach to youth exiting the care system. And then finally, and I was just on this amazing call the other day with the Ontario Children's Lawyer, where a couple of folks from Ryerson were presenting on recent provincial data through stepstones. Although seemingly cost prohibitive to run this kind of a model at the outset, there's old and fresh analysis that demonstrates that smaller numbers on longer timelines equal fewer youth exiting emergency services, accessing hospitals and emergency departments. So we know, and I mean, ultimately leading to more young people accessing education and creating parity in the labor market. So we know that it costs more not to do the Housing First work than to do the Housing First work, honestly. And I'll just end off on that note. Thanks, guys, for letting me speak, and we'll come back to this at the end with the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. We're going to move to Zach. And Zach, confirming, you don't have slides, right?
I don't. That's correct.
No, great. Okay. Thanks. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And really great presentations from everybody so far. Thanks, Eric. Excellent rundown of your program. And similarly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing here in Vancouver. And I would just like to start by acknowledging that here in Vancouver, we are on the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. And we are very privileged to do our work here. And yeah, I mean, I work for Pacific Community Resource Society. We are one of the larger players in the nonprofit sector here in Vancouver, and certainly as regards youth housing. Specifically, in our history of doing housing work here at PCRS goes back a long time. We are a 35-year-old organization that I think has always had a toe in the sort of housing world. But when I first joined PCRS 14 years ago, there was our housing programming was very, very limited. We were working with a handful of landlords that maybe had very low end of market basement suites or apartments, you know, around the city, and trying to support youth living in those houses and those units. And it was a very small affair at the time. Because it's sort of strange to think, but you know, given the fact that homelessness has been a sort of endemic issue in Vancouver going back many decades and generations when we're talking about our participants, it really was not something that I think the nonprofit world was dealing with up until kind of the sort of millennium, it feels like. And certainly what we began to see is that provincial and federal forces began to be aligned in the goal of at least beginning the work to try and address the homelessness problem here in Vancouver, and I think generally speaking across the country. So we began to build what we have now come to think of as a housing continuum as we took over some housing sites and designated really with the goal of working with youth under the age of 25. We've been doing that work for several years when the Housing First contracts first hit the scene, and we were keen to get involved. And really some stars aligned for us in that we were able to purchase some homes. In Vancouver, we call them Vancouver Specials. They're really kind of just a big sort of boxy house that's designed to house as many people as possible. And with the support of BC Housing, we purchased a few of those. But what we needed was the sort of ongoing funding to staff those houses, and Housing First really allowed us to answer that question. In the initial phase of rolling out our Housing First program, we did find that the nature of the programming was prescriptive in a certain way that did not feel very youth friendly. So some of the mandates around how to define homelessness and how to define an individual and someone at risk of homelessness, we felt ignored the reality for many of the young people here in Vancouver that we were serving and that we were seeing, which is that young people tend to fly under the radar. Many people under the age of 25 are not sleeping rough in doorways or under overpasses or in encampments. They are sleeping on their friends' couches. They are sort of staying with family and natural supports. But what we experience very acutely here in Vancouver, and I think it's a factor throughout the country, is generational poverty and generational homelessness. And we work with many folks who their parents live in the downtown east side in SROs, or their parents may in fact be homeless themselves. Many of our participants come from foster care. We sort of we see ourselves as working with a triple mandate here at PCRS. So in our Vancouver housing programs, roughly 30% of our housing is designated for youth exiting the foster care system, and 30% of our housing is for youth who identify as LGBTQ+. 30% is identified for youth who identify as Indigenous, and of course, there's lots of crossover in those three populations that we're working with. And so, working with those mandates, we were finding that many of our youth sort of were not necessarily going to fall under the prescriptive definition of what homelessness looked like for the Housing First program, but nevertheless, we felt that they were homeless and that they were at risk of homelessness, and that the sort of focus of doing youth homelessness work is really around trying to prevent sort of that entrenchment into a long-term cycle of homelessness for young folks, because we know that re-traumatization can occur with and deepen the problems that lead a person to be at risk of homelessness, to stay at risk of homelessness. So we did our best to work within those mandates, and what we found is that many of the people that we were working with were sort of, because we were trying to work within that very prescriptive description of homelessness, were at an extremely high acuity, and very experiencing really severe mental health and addictions issues that made the idea of living in a sort of shared accommodation model, even with staff supports, quite challenging. You have multiple people that are dealing with very active substance use and very active mental health issues, all under one roof. It can be, even at a small scale, difficult to manage. And I think that what that led to for us was a reimagining of our housing continuum and a very positive change for the organization, because it forced us to really maximize what we had. In our initial phase of rolling out Housing First programming, we were really thinking, okay, the Housing First units will be in these three houses that we own, and those are going to be our Housing First sites. what we were finding is that we needed more flexibility to work with the clients that we were seeing, because you might have somebody who is at risk of homelessness, but they are trying to go to school, they're trying to get a job, they are trying to lead a life that requires being able to go to bed at a certain time and getting up in the morning at a certain time, and it's not compatible with somebody who's up, the guy in the room next door is up all night long and making noise, and has is dealing with issues that are preventing that other youth from being able to work on their goals. So we had to be able to look at our overall housing stock, which included one-bedroom apartments, included bachelor suites, and it included portable rental subsidies for market accommodation, and start to think about how do we match our housing to our participant rather than trying to find participants that match the specific housing. And I think it really forced a very positive operational shift in the way that we thought of our program, and allowed us to sort of break out of the silos, which I really think those silos were the result of funding and funding mandates, and when you're interfacing with multiple levels of funding, whether you're talking about federal funding, provincial funding, municipal funding, and privately raised funding, all of those things tend to come with their own ideas about how you work with young people, and the reality of what we were dealing with around Housing First really meant, like, okay, we need to sort of break out of these silos and think about, we have this overall picture, and trying to make sure that we were able to provide the best type of housing for each individual, and in doing so, it really did allow us to achieve much better outcomes, but also to avoid discharges to homelessness, in most cases. And it has been a very positive change for our organization and our team. I think a big part of that happened. We did a fidelity review at probably 3 years into our Housing First funding, and that I think was a great process. We got great feedback, and it was very positive, but it also really forced us to re-examine a core principle of our programming, which was our age out and our timelines. Eric spoke a little bit about this as well. But historically, all of our programming was really we always kept it on a 2-year timeline to try and get people to move through that continuum and stabilize and then sort of move on to independence. What the feedback we got from our fidelity review is that that was not consistent with the principles of Housing First, but it really again forced us to re-examine our programming and ask ourselves the difficult question of, well, was that ever realistic? I mean, and what we realized is that 2 years was not, even long before we were doing Housing First or before the fidelity review, 2 years was not a realistic timeline for people to sort of stabilize and move on to the absolutely brutal market reality of trying to find housing in Vancouver, and particularly when we're talking about a huge portion of the population we work with coming directly from foster care, and in almost all of those cases having no life skills, that not no life skills, but a very low level of life skills and very low level of independence in terms of their housing. So again, it was a process of revisioning for us, and trying to look at Housing First as one of the key factors in our sort of funding model, but also trying to universalize the work that we were doing so it was consistent with the principles of Housing First. Again, these are very positive changes that came through for us. We, similarly to Eric, we also work with a quarterly assessment that we call it the impact assessment. But again, we're working one-on-one with our participants, where we are asking them via an interview to identify the areas that they feel that they need to work on, or that they feel they have improved on. And we found that by going over these steps on a quarterly basis, it is helpful not only from a programming and operation perspective in terms of designating what is the work, what does this participant need to achieve, and how can we support them over the next while, but I think also in sort of grounding the participant within the program to say, this is where I've come. This is how far I've come in the time that I've been here. Or, it's not always sunshine and roses. There are instances where somebody might say, I've had a really difficult 3 months, and something that didn't feel like it was a problem 3 months ago has really become something I'm struggling with right now. So it's a reflective process, but it is a essential part of the work that we're doing. Let me think. I think that the realities of the housing market here in Vancouver inform the work that we're doing, and homelessness for us is really a symptom of the inequality that's built into the structure of this city, and the reality of housing here. We unfortunately we've seen that situation just get worse and worse. COVID, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the impact of COVID on housing in Vancouver and specifically in terms of the people that we're working with. It was very interesting in the early few months, the first sort of few months of COVID, we actually saw an interesting thing happening where, because of the sort of decline in tourism and in international students, and that the sort of fear that I think many landlords and landowners in Vancouver had, we actually saw that there was a little bit of a dip for the first time in decades, a little dip in prices, and people were able suddenly to find housing that historically would not have seemed feasible. And we were very hopeful that this could be a new day in housing in Vancouver, and hopeful that we were going to be able to really see some movement on people being able to exit the system. And unfortunately, there's been a major rebound with inflation, the sort of runaway inflation effect, and the absolutely out of control housing market. And where people are once again finding their backs against the wall and with nowhere to turn. And again, that comes back to our question of mandates around timelines and where do people go. And so what we are unfortunately finding is that even when somebody is ready to take that step into independence and not living with the support of a housing worker or a subsidy, there's not really anything out there for them, which is challenging. Some major changes in terms of housing have occurred. The modular housing has become a major force here in Vancouver, and we have seen some positive change there, but it's been a drop in the bucket of what's needed, unfortunately. And so we've seen a lot of change over the last several years, and it is a mix of positive and negative. But I think Housing First has become an important tool for us to really reach out and again, try and prevent instances of homelessness for young people, particularly as they exit care. I think Eric made an excellent point when he was discussing that, and that's definitely a reality that we see in Vancouver as well. A huge component of the young people that we see are people who have experience in the foster care system. And for those who are homeless at the time of intake, many of them report that their first instance of homelessness was within 6 months of exiting foster care. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and we do really see that Housing First for Youth is a major tool, particularly as it embraces the idea of supporting young people that are exiting systems of care to avoid that sort of pitfall of entering homelessness and potentially becoming entrenched within that world. And so that's really where we see ourselves coming in and providing support in that way.
Thank you, Zach. I love the intersections between systems work here and the focus that you both made on the opportunities that exist around kind of harmonizing and shrinking the gap between systems, community system being one, government systems being another, and how Housing First for Youth can play a role in bringing those two together. So thank you for that. Cheryl, I'm going to share my screen again. And we're over to you. 1 second. There we go. So you can all see that. Take it away.
Thanks, David. My presentation isn't as quite as lengthy and detailed as Eric's for sure, so I definitely need to take some pointers from him on developing an appropriate presentation. So thanks for that, Eric and Zach. You both shared a lot of really helpful information in terms of that cross connection between all the demonstration projects and the work that we're doing in Housing First for Youth. Undayan is a Housing First Youth project out of the Hamilton Regional Indian Center. And when I first started to look at what was needed in our community as a youth and transition worker who specifically supported Indigenous youth who were exiting the child welfare system, housing was one of the major components that was lacking to support Indigenous youth. So I definitely can see where Zach's numbers came from in terms of youth exiting child welfare and within 6 months or so becoming homeless, because there's just not, there are not enough supports and services to be able to provide to our young people to ensure they're not entering into the homelessness world. And so when we looked at Undayan in the development, we looked at what was our target population, and clearly Indigenous young people are our priority, but also including those who are exiting systems, so the child welfare system, the justice system, and the healthcare system, all where Indigenous young people and Indigenous people in general are overrepresented but undercounted. And so it's really important that we provide supports and services to that demographic in order to reduce or eliminate further possibility of homelessness in adults. And so in the work that we have done, it's really about how do we align what was developed by making the shift and kind of manipulate that, so to speak, in a way that works for Indigenous people. As Zach had mentioned, he talked about the definition of Indigenous homelessness. And that is really important to look at when you're working with Indigenous people in the homelessness world, because there's a different level of understanding, there's a different level of belief, there's a different level of knowing and being that are articulated in that definition that I think everyone should be aware of. At this point, there isn't a national definition for Indigenous youth homelessness. However, my hope is that that is something that's coming out very soon to help guide the work that many people are doing. And so, it is important to also recognize that I think Zach had mentioned it in terms of what is homelessness. Many Indigenous people, including young people, will tend to sleep on someone's couch, a friend, an auntie, an uncle, a cousin. And we look at that as kind of our, it's our innate nature to bring in family and to provide those supports. And unfortunately, there's a lot of programs that are out there that don't consider hidden homelessness as a criteria for some of their programs. So it's important to recognize the issues and traumas that Indigenous people face and continue to face, and in terms of program development and delivery, recognizing those things. And so with Housing First for Youth and doing the work that we have done with making the shift, it's really important that Indigenous people have the opportunity to create, design, develop, and deliver all of their ways of being and knowing, and have the ability to develop those things in a way that is going to make the greatest impact on Indigenous people. And so Housing First for Youth has their core principles, which are outlined here in this case management model. So we had the ability to look at, what are these core principles that is the foundation of Housing First for Youth. And so when you look at 1 to 5, we have them here in just out beside the youth circle. And for us, it was a matter of doing the work to how do we align this? How do we bring Indigenous culture of ways of being and knowing into this framework that has been developed so that we're meeting the needs of our funder, which is really important, but also meeting the needs of what our communities are looking for in terms of addressing trauma and being able to move forward to either obtain, sustain, or stabilize their housing. And so we did a lot of work to kind of get to this point to develop this Housing First for Youth case management model. And part of that is, sorry, David, do I only have the one slide or do you have the, okay, here we go. So we were able to do the this is a timeline. Which is really important because a lot of this is the background work before a project or program is implemented. And I think this is what is really important to get everybody on the same page in terms of the importance of including Indigenous people in the decision making, in what works for Indigenous people, and doing things in a good way. And so when April 2017 is when we got the notification that Making the Shift project was initiated. And then in August of 2017, myself and a coworker delivered cultural competency training to other demonstration sites and other projects under Making the Shift. This was done to be able to inform and provide kind of a foundation in the terms of the work that they are doing in their own programs and how they're engaging with Indigenous people and having that understanding of colonization and how those have continued to impact Indigenous people. In November 2017, we did a sunrise ceremony and really utilize this as kind of the birth of Undayan. And what that looked like was being able to bring our partners together. We brought staff from Away Home, staff from COH, we brought young people, we brought firekeepers and an elder as well. And we were able to have a sunrise ceremony and a fire where we offered our tobacco in the context of what our intentions are for this project and doing this work in a good way and having the ability to come together and allow that level of understanding. I utilize this and I go back to the CHRA wampum and just the ability to, ensure that our voices are being heard and what we are saying is actually being implemented and utilized. In February 2018, we had a partnership with Wakabin S. Bryce, and that is primarily to ensure that the research component of this project is done from an Indigenous perspective and foundation, and that the way that information and research is being captured is done in a culturally safe and appropriate way. In May 2018, we held a visioning session, and what that entailed was bringing youth as well as community agencies and partners together to talk about Undayan and what can their contribution be to this project. And then continuing on, so October 2018, we met with Home Fire and being able to learn from that project, that program, as well as we traveled to Edmonton as well as in Calgary to do our own research in terms of what is being offered to Indigenous young people, what's working, what isn't, what are some of the challenges that they experienced in their development of their programs, and kind of, if you could make this your own, what would that look like? So we did a lot of work in terms of gathering that information before determining what our Undiane Housing First for Youth project would look like. And then at that point, we had an elder knowledge keeper and youth gathering in January of 2019. And in that setting, we provided an overview of our intent of the project, our case management model, the teachings that we would be utilizing, and over 3 days gathered feedback from our young people and our elders and knowledge keepers, because they are the experts. They are the ones that really should be informing the way that we do our work, because we may think one thing and the reality is that just might not work for our young people, and ensuring that we are aligning with a fulsome cultural base. And then, so February 2019 is when we launched Undiane. And then in March 2019, we allowed our young people to design our logo. And so all of those things typically were done even before, other than the logo design, were done before the launch, to ensure that we were doing this work in a good way and really incorporating the thoughts and ideas, the wants and needs from our young people. And so then from there, we implemented this case management model. David, if you don't mind, if you can just go back to the one slide, that would be super helpful. And so it's important, again, that, we're recognizing that, a mainstream organization developed this work, and having that flexibility and autonomy to be able to make it our own in terms of being reflective of Indigenous cultural ways of being and knowing has been a true asset to the program. And I think the success and the work that we're doing with engaging with young people. And so with the case management model, it shows here in the middle. Originally, we started off with youth here in the middle. However, our young people felt that it should actually be you, right? Because it's about them. It's about that young person and how we are supporting them to achieve their goals of balance and wellness in their lifestyle. And so from there, we have our Housing First for Youth core principles. And then just outside that is the Circle of Courage. And the Circle of Courage has a foundation of someone's spirit, and recognizing how that spirit fuels us every day to do the things that we do. And unfortunately, due to trauma, grief, and other issues, those impact our spirit. And so young people tend to have either a broken or distorted spirit in terms of their belief system, the way that they do things, who they are, and where they come from. And it's important to focus on that, because in the work that we do, the ability to be able to support a young person and to mend that broken spirit, to change their thought process in terms of what their belief system is, in terms of even their Indigenous identity. If they had been taught that identifying as an Indigenous person is a detriment to them because their mom or their dad or someone in their family had been ill-treated, or something negative came out of them identifying of who they are, then that has kind of distorted their spirit in terms of being a proud Indigenous person and honoring who you are and where you come from, because we all should be honored. And so it's important that we look at that as a means of healing and moving forward. And then we have our 7 grandfather teachings. And our 7 grandfather teachings are a way of living a good path. And these are all things that, you know, many of us had been taught in one way or another, you know, growing up. And these are things that are important within Indigenous culture to be able to, like I said, be on a good path and live a balanced lifestyle, as well as the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel of 4 colors here represent, you know, the four directions. It can represent the 4 races of man, our 4 sacred medicines. And there's many, many teachings that go along with the medicine wheel, and we incorporate those in our day-to-day engagement with our young people. And then on the outside is the Housing First for Youth outcomes. And in order to achieve those outcomes, you need to have that supportive community. You need to have that connection to your community. You need to be aware of what is available in your community to access resources. And so community connects all of this together in order for our young people to be successful. So that is our case management model and the way that we do things. And I think that it's really important to recognize that when or if you are delivering an Indigenous specific project or program, that you have input and direction and delivery by Indigenous people to be able to ensure that things are being done in a good way. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which is really important when you're implementing any sort of program that has to do with housing, is that available housing stock. I think Zach had mentioned, I think they had 3 houses in his program to be able to house young people. And that's one of the challenges here in Hamilton, is securing safe, affordable housing that is suitable for young people. We had a community, 2 community members who wanted to purchase a home and renovate it and turn it into a place where Undayan participants would be able to have their own unit, but have a space where they could congregate and gather together. And this process went on for well over a year of back and forth of supporting them with the city of Hamilton. And, you know, there's many things that are behind the scenes that I really wasn't aware of or had any sort of knowledge about prior to this partnership. And, you know, there's many things in terms of permits, zoning, and the biggest one that we encountered was development charges. And I recently saw an article somewhere where the Catholic board, and I'm not sure if it was here in Hamilton or where it was, but development charges are a very, very broad scope of fees that get charged to someone who's doing renovations or upgrades or creating new opportunities. And the city of Hamilton was going to charge them $150,000 in development charges, because they were a not-for-profit organization. And so we advocated at many levels to try and make this work. And ultimately, it came down to that they would still have to pay various development charges in terms of making this happen. And it was just an expense that our landlords, you know, didn't have the flexibility to cover those costs. And we ultimately lost out on that opportunity, which was very disheartening for Undayan, for our community members who are wanting to do this to give back, and also very costly. But with that being said, it's really important to continue working towards creating those partnerships with those housing providers, because, you know, we have young people who need housing, and, you know, the primary context of Housing First for Youth is housing. And it's hard for us to do our work and do our job and to help these young people be successful when housing is the barrier. Right. And it doesn't allow them to work on their substance use, their trauma, their mental health, their education, and so on, when they do not feel like they have a safe place to rest their head at night. And so if I could leave you with anything, it is the importance of sustainable, affordable, and safe housing for our young people. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, that's almost our time. I flipped some questions to our presenters before this, and maybe they were too tough or something because they used up all the time. So now we don't have time for questions. But I'm going to offer up. So if there are questions from any of the attendees, because we're sort of running short on time, and I know Jacob probably has a few words for us as well. I'm going to open up my email. And so if you have questions about any of this, and if there are things that each of our presenters has shared that you want to dig into a bit further, I'm happy to help facilitate and curate that dialogue with yourself. We will make the presentations available to you. So if that's part of the recording option, Jacob, I'm assuming, where we can post the presentation. So we'll do that. You have my commitment on that. And again, yeah, if you have any questions, just please shoot them my way. And I want to thank Jacob and CHRA for creating this space for us, and our presenters for the dialogue and the thoughtfulness to which you put into your presentations and the time you spent with us. I'm better because of it, and I'm sure our presenters or our attendees are as well. So, Jacob, final words.
Thanks, David. I think you summed up everything very well. Happy to distribute the recording and the slide deck. Thank you, David, Cheryl, Eric, Heidi, and Zach for the great discussion. It was really interesting. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us for our last CHRA webinar of 2021. Yeah, take care, stay safe, and have a safe and happy holiday season.
Yeah, take care all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.